The 1920s in America are often referred to as the decade of prosperity, a time when productivity increased daily. New industries such as aviation began to prosper, while exciting industries like food processing and weaponry modeled their factories after Henry Ford's assembly line. By 1929, the United States was viewed as the world's industrial leader and produced roughly 40% of the world's manufactured goods. The largest industry in America was the automobile industry. By the end of 1929, the United States produced over 85% of the world's vehicles, and 52% of American families owned a car. The automobile industry was not only prosperous in itself, but it also stimulated the American economy by expanding steel, oil, road construction, and rubber industries. Furthermore, it promoted tourism and the growth of suburbs. In 1923, President Calvin Coolidge stated that the chief business of the American people is business. Business expansion also quickly changed the American way of life through consumer goods. Advertisements and salesmen sought to sell their goods as a way of satisfying everyday needs. Urban and suburban families frequently purchased on credit in order to obtain the latest household advancements that would make their lives easier. Vacuum cleaners and electric washing machines were the most popular purchases of 1923, most of which were purchased through monthly installment plans. Purchased new, a refrigerator would cost $714 in 1923. Since many Americans could not afford this expense in one lump sum, buying on credit was their saving grace. These appliances not only revolutionized household work, but the American way of living as well. The 1920s also saw the widespread use and consumption of Coca-Cola, Kool-Aid, the Band-Aid, the hairdryer, and a lie detector, just to name a few. General Mills and Betty Crocker also got their start in 1921, and by 1924 had created their first cereal, Wheaties. Ironically, Wheaties would become a staple for dwellers in Hoovervilles, and some might argue that American starvation rates during the Great Depression would have increased had it not been for the high production rates of non-perishable goods like cereal during the 1920s. George Eastman propelled his Kodak business into mainstream life, and inventors like Thomas Edison used his technology to capture the American way of life on film. Telephone communications also became easier, and jazz music became a symbol of American culture. For the first time in American history, vacations were not a sole pastime of the rich, and most American families spent more of their incomes on trips away from home, sporting events, and movies. By 1929, weekly movie attendance reached 80 million, a figure doubled from 1922. Radios also transformed everyday life by bringing news and entertainment into the American home. The number of radios in homes increased from 200,000 in 1923 to 5 million in 1929. Women became increasingly more independent as the quest for self-determination led to sexual freedom and personal rebellion. The 1920s flapper could be found dancing the Charleston at jazz clubs, smoking cigarettes, drinking in public, and unapologetically using birth control methods such as the diaphragm. She would have bobbed hair, short skirts, and more makeup than had been seen a generation earlier. Legal measures were even presented in some cities to prevent women from wearing skirts with a hemline 3 inches above their ankles. The flapper embodied the changing attitudes toward how women were expected to behave in society. Mainstream culture of the 1920s supported newfound freedoms, especially in the form of advertising. Products from cigarettes to makeup were marketed to women, but the personal liberation movement often ended when a woman found a husband, and her freedoms were expected to be found within her home, such as in new household appliances and other technologies. The 1920s saw 3 presidents. The first, Warren G. Harding, became the 29th President of the United States in 1921. Harding's administration became one of the most corrupt in American history, as President Harding seemed to have little regard for either governmental issues or the dignity of the presidency. The 18th Amendment in favor of prohibition did not stop Harding from satisfying his desires for liquor. He also was known to have numerous affairs and had an illegitimate child with his longtime mistress, Nan Britton, who published The President's Daughter in 1927, revealing the affair and the lack of money Harding left in his will to his daughter for the first time. Harding was also known to appoint his cronies to his cabinet. These politicians used public office for their private interests, as seen in the Teapot Dome scandal. After Harding's death in 1923, Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as president. The former governor of Massachusetts, Coolidge was nicknamed Silent Cal and rarely spoke in public. His inaugural address became the shortest on record, just 125 words. Coolidge won re-election in 1924 by a landslide, crushing the Democratic nominee John W. Davis and the Progressive Party nominee Robert La Follette. In 1927, when President Coolidge handed a piece of paper to a group of reporters that stated, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928, Herbert Hoover quickly emerged as his successor. Historians argue that few men elected as president have seemed destined for a more successful term in office than Herbert Hoover. Hoover easily won the election of 1928 and promised that poverty would be banished from the earth forever under his administration. Less than a year into his presidency, however, the stock market crashed on October 24, 1929, or Black Thursday. As investors panicked and began to sell their shares of stock, more than $10 billion in market value vanished in just 5 hours. The United States soon found itself in the middle of the greatest economic disaster in modern history. But the stock market crash was not the sole cause of the Great Depression. Even before 1929, signs of economic trouble were clear. Florida and Southern California experienced a euphoria of real estate speculation that led to land busts and mortgage foreclosures. A decade-long depression in farm regions during the 1920s reduced purchasing power and decreased the value of American goods. Sales of new automobiles and household consumer goods stalled after 1927, as many Americans who purchased expensive items on credit were unable to pay their monthly installments. World War I also affected the American economy, as Germany defaulted on war reparations to France and Britain, and thus France and Britain defaulted on debts they owed to American banks. Between 1929 and 1932, the price of a share of U.S. steel fell from $262 to just $22, and General Motors stock fell from $73 a share to only $8. The Depression quickly altered the American way of life, especially in the middle and lower classes. Even the most wealthy Americans were hurt by the Depression, including the Rockefeller family, who lost 2/3 of its fortune in 1929 alone. Hundreds of thousands of people searched for work each day, and hungry men, women, and children lined the streets of major cities in Hoovervilles, a name given in defiance of what many Americans believed to be President Hoover's ignorance of the state of the country. Bonus marchers arrived in Washington, D.C. to protest Hoover's failed policies on promised World War I payments, but were evicted by federal troops. Although the 1920s were prosperous times, many groups of Americans felt ignored by the decade's promises of prosperity. Immigrants were often viewed as threats to the American way of life, as seen in the Sacco Vanzetti trial of 1921 and in a number of Supreme Court decisions in the early part of the decade. Rural farmers also did not share in the prosperous times of urban America, and the women's movement lost momentum after the suffrage movement ended. Female voices went unheard as black women worked to see the 15th Amendment enforced. Culture wars were abundant in society, as many Americans embraced newfound urban culture. Others found the new society alarming and felt threatened by the decline of traditional values. Fundamentalist preachers like Billy Sunday, a former professional baseball player, drew huge crowds as they denounced the sins of Darwinism, alcohol, women's liberation, sexual sins, and other alarming new characteristics of the 1920s. Fundamentalists also strongly supported prohibition, although the establishment of illegal speakeasies saw record profits during Prohibition, as did the bootleggers who supplied them. The KKK resurfaced in the 1920s after the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager accused of killing a teenage girl. The Scopes trial also deeply divided America. The 1920s forever altered the way in which Americans lived their lives. Buying items on credit, widespread use of new technologies such as the automobile and telephone communications can be attributed to the innovations and industrial expansion of the 1920s in America.